Today on Ancestors.
For us to find any hope in the future, we all got to go backwards first. Instead of with fear of the future, we come back with pride and a warm understanding. Because we've reconnected ourselves to our own Garden of Eden.
It was unbelievable for me at age 14 that this tiny old woman could have a great-grandmother. And I wanted to know more about her. And all I knew was Patsy the Witch.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support Ancestors.
Ancestors, with hosts Jim and Terry Willard.
Today, we will discover that family history and genealogy are much more than dusty records and forgotten relatives. It's about the desire we all have to understand who we are and where we came from, and the powerful impact the search for roots can have on each of us in our families.
We'll visit with a professional genealogist who will show us how easy it is to take the first step toward discovering our roots.
But let's first go to Southern California and visit with Victor Villaseñor, a writer whose life was transformed by his passion for family history.
For us to find any hope in the future, we all got to go backwards first and get in touch with our past. Then come forward. Instead of with fear of the future, we come back with pride and a warm understanding. The biggest thing to get over is that it's always easier to think that the grass is greener on the other side. When I started my parents' story, I thought that the story of the people down the street was a better story, and the story over there was a better story, and I didn't think much of my own parents. My father was always teasing and always had this kind of wild thing. He told me to start, just before I started kindergarten, he told me that everybody in the world was Mexican. And he said, and if they're not, they want to be. That wasn't quite the way it happened. It happened with a little kid. I'll never forget it. His name was Howard. And he was a redheaded kid with a lot of freckles. And it happened, 40 years ago, and it still hurts. I mean, to remember it. It's just these things never leave you. He said, "Are you Mexican?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm Mexican." And when I said that, he started crying and screaming. And he screamed, "You got a knife." I said, "Howard, I don't got a knife." And he said, "Oh, yes, you do. Mexicans always got a knife." And I remember I said, I didn't know. I'll bring one tomorrow." And he said, "I can't play with you. Mexicans are bad people." And he said that, and I remember what I said. I said, "Oh, I didn't know. I'm sorry." And I'm not even in first grade, and I already know that my people are bad, are stupid, people are frightened of them, they carry knives, they're dangerous. And now the thing about it that happened is I didn't start resenting the teacher, because she's the teacher. The establishment is the authority. I was the figure. I immediately began to hate my parents and think they'd lied to me and they were fools. I thought Mexicans were less than the French or the Irish. I thought their story maybe were inferior. I thought my parents' stories were maybe lies. Like some of the stories my father would tell me, like that there was a big serpent, a big snake that had eaten kids in the village. Everyone was terrified about it. And his father, a great horseman, the serpent came at him on horseback, stood up 8 feet tall and came at him. And he took a tree branch, broke it off, and fought with the serpent, rammed it into his mouth, and then roped it and dragged it. It was like St. George, you know, the dragon in Europe. And I thought those were all legends. And my father says, no, it's true. But then I'm at San Diego Zoo, and I go to the man who's ever studies snakeology or whatever, and and I ask him, I hear that there's a snake that can stand up 8 feet tall and would attack a man on horseback. Is that possible? And he says, oh yeah, that's the Bushmaster. And I said, what? And he says, yeah, if they're 14 feet long, they stand up 7 feet, half their length. And if they're 16, they stand up 8. And they look around like this. And he said, they were fearless. That's why they're basically extinct. They would attack a train, an automobile. So sure, they attack a man on horseback. And I said, oh my God, I am the doubting Thomas. But when I went to Mexico, I was 19 years old. It just opened up my eyes to the music, to the culture of the Indians. And then I could see Indian cultures thousands of years before Columbus. And then I saw Indian mothers nursing their young and taking care of all the rich colors and the food and all of a sudden I said, oh my God, I come from somebody, from somewhere. And then the next thing is, I am somebody. And then as soon as I realized I come from somewhere and I am somebody, it's like a great peace happens in your stomach. And then I started crying. I remember I just was crying and crying. And then I started understanding my parents were good people, you know, and I'd been mad at them all this year. They hadn't lied to me. It was like this $1 million treasure that they've given me of stories. And any time you have doubt or you start falling apart, you just reach into the book and you pull out another story. And then your life in the present doesn't seem hopeless and doesn't seem weak. It seems like this is the way they did it. I can do it. One thing about when you research your parents that happens is now my parents are my greatest heroes. And that doesn't happen to you. Interview your own parents and your grandparents and get to know them really, really, really well without judgment. And like my father, the train was leaving and they were going north and the revolution was going on all over. And my father and these kids started playing toreando el tren, that means kind of being chicken. So they jumped off the train, everybody's going on the train north. Their families and everything with soldiers and horses, you know, all this equipment in the middle of war. And these kids get off and say, let's see who's the last one to get on the train. Let's see who's the bravest. Well, the kids got scared and jumped on the train. My father was so dumb and brave, he waited until the train was too far. And the train left him with all his family, and he's there left in the middle of the desert, in the middle of nowhere. And the other kid that was left with him had more family. So then my father starts running after the train. When you have love pulling you and you have fear pushing you, you can do what you never dreamed possible. He kept saying, Mama, Mama, running up the tracks, you know, don't leave me, Mama. And then he had all this fear being left behind. And he ran in the hot desert without food or water all day until his huaraches were ripped off his feet. Then he ran barefoot until he had bloody stumps. He ran all night. He ran over 100 miles. We went back and found the distances. He ran over 100 miles, a little kid, and he finally caught the train because it broke down. What it did was it just swelled up my heart with pride and gave me this abundance of confidence that if my dad can do that, that means I could do something like that. That means, so when I wrote 10 years and got 265 rejections of my books, and I never gave up, because when you're writing about people that never give up, well, how can you give up? I mean, if you're writing about people that give up and fall apart and get drunk and all that, well, then it's pretty easy to fall apart and, you know, get drunk and give up. But so my parents, my father, just this incredible feat that a child can do. And I said, well, then I can do it. And that's what a family tree is about. A family history is that they give you invisible energy, invisible. It's like your subconscious, the back of your brain, the back of your heart is pumped with all this power that makes you feel wonderful. Once you really start talking and getting to know people deep inside, an ordinary story can become this great, great, wonderful. Everyone is special. See, it's really true. I mean, we've all heard that cliche, but it's not a cliche. Until you get into the roots of your family, you're absolutely lost. You're just like a ship out at sea in storms, and you're helpless. And then when you start getting in, knowing, and you see how your parents and your grandparents made their decisions, and sometimes they make stupid decisions, but at least you can sympathize how they made them. All of a sudden you feel so good, and you forgive yourself for the screw-ups you make. My mother said it best. She was being interviewed once, and somebody asked her, what do you think of your son writing this book? What did you think when it first started? And she said, well, when he first started talking to me and asking me stories about our life in Mexico and about his grandmother and all that, I said to him, who's gonna care? This is, we're not educated people. We're not special. We're just workers. We're nobody. And then she said, then as my son started rewriting it, I began to see that anybody's story is wonderful. That we that think we're nobodies have very special stories. And it was like my mother, through the writing process, has become kind of her own hero too. Once you get your parents excited, once you get your grandparents excited, once you get your aunts and uncles excited about it because you really are showing that you care, wow, they bring you stuff. They start doing research too. They bring you photographs. They bring you this. I feel right now like I'm really grateful that my kids got to know their grandparents, and not just know them physically, but know their stories. And they can hand that story to their kids and their kids' kids. And it's like, my God, we're back in the Garden of Eden. The world's young, and there's hope in the world. And the 20th century is no big deal. We're going to go into the 21st century with power and confidence because we've reconnected ourselves to our own Garden of Eden, our own Adam and Eve, our own beginning, like the Navajos say. And then there's an exhilarating feeling of feeling connected to the earth, to the sacred ground and the heavens of your family.
Welcome, Desmond. We're very glad to have you with us today. Tell us something about how you got started in your own family research.
Well, Jim, I got started because of an interesting ancestor of mine. Her name is Patsy the Witch.
How old were you when you heard about Patsy?
I was 14.
Wow.
That was an impressionable age.
That was a very
actually.
impressionable
She must have
age.
made a real impact.
Well, she was my great-grandmother's great-grandmother. And my great-grandmother told me about her. And it was unbelievable for me at age 14 that this tiny old woman could have a great-grandmother. And I wanted to know more about her. And all I knew was Patsy the Witch. Her name is Martha Vaughn. Her real name is Martha Vaughn.
When you say witch, did she have like special gifts or talents that?
She wasn't a New England kind of witch that just got dunked and burned. This is the kind of thing where she had an unpleasant personality combined with some of that ESP. And she lived to be a very remarkable old age. And she made some interesting predictions. She was a very colorful ancestor.
Just a great character.
Yeah.
Could we start with just a basic definition of the word ancestor?
An ancestor is someone from whom you're descended. It's as simple as that. It's people called grandma, people called grandpa, great-grandparents, and all the way back, people that we've never met and don't know. Those are our ancestors. They're people who contributed directly to our genes.
You mean my gray hair?
Your gray
Had to
hair,
come from somebody.
my brown eyes.
Or my big nose?
your
French Canadian
hairline.
background, that's all.
Yeah, all those
All of
wonderful
that.
features that go into make you up, those are all from your ancestors, people from whom you're directly descended.
Okay. What about like my aunts and uncles and are they ancestors?
Those are not your ancestors. They're a part of your family, but they're not your ancestors.
In terms of how we record that, how we have this information to maybe share with others or view ourselves, but can we look at some of the ways people have recorded some of this
Certainly.
information?
And I brought some charts with me to show you all. This chart is the family of Robert Brown Butler.
Okay.
And it's a very interesting way to represent his ancestors. He starts with himself here, and these are all of the ancestors from whom he's descended.
I really like the way it
It's a
branches
lot.
out, and also I like all this information.
lot of information
It's really,
on there.
I think that's really attractive,
Yeah.
suitable for framing.
Suitable for framing. He's written information about what ships the folks came over on, some of them who lived to be a remarkable old age. He's done some really neat things with this.
Okay, and these are his ancestors.
These are his
the-
ancestors.
Okay.
And this is not the only way to represent ancestors on a
Okay.
chart.
Okay.
Let me show you a very old one. This is a real fun chart. This is the pedigree chart of a man named Henry II, who was the Holy Roman Emperor. This is taken from the Nuremberg Chronicle, and it's from the Newberry Library in Chicago. And this is Henry in the upper corner up here, and it
Okay.
shows all of his ancestors in this wonderfully unique graphic representation. And this is umbilical cords. Because
And
see,
It's really
this
pretty.
was about royalty. This was about his claim to the throne. He needed to show that, you know,
that
he was
descended.
entitled.
But these things are really beyond what
These things, you would
most
not
of
draw
us.
this chart for your family, probably.
Okay.
Okay.
What would we use? What, you know?
What we would use today is a standard pedigree chart.
Okay.
And it looks like
Yep.
this, Jim.
Yep.
And this pedigree chart is a graphic representation of who your ancestors are. Let me tell you about an interesting man named George Everton. Many years ago, he got started as a pioneer in the modern genealogy field, and he couldn't find a pedigree chart. So he had to go to horse breeders and dog breeders to find a pedigree
But,
chart.
you know, in addition, when you hear the word pedigree, that's normally what you think of. Is,
Bloodline is-
Sure, yeah.
But it's still not very flattering to me as a human being to think that, you know,
You could be put on a dog chart.
you know.
Exactly. Well, this pedigree chart is a simple form of those other two things, and it does the same thing. It accomplishes the same purpose. It's a roadmap, is what it is, and it starts with you. Let me just write you
So
in there.
that's the most important thing for us to remember right at this point, is that you have to start.
You
Start
start
with
with
ourselves.
yourself, and you put yourself as the first person on the chart. And this is a roadmap back to find those ancestors.
So everybody on here will be an
Your
ancestor.
ancestors.
Okay. And after you start with yourself,
You'd put in, the next people you would put in would be your parents.
There's Dad.
You'd put your dad here, and you'd put your mom
goes
here.
down there.
right,
And then what, if I'm hearing you right, and I mean, we've worked with these before, this would be my father's ancestors going
Right.
back this way, and this would be my mother's ancestors going back this way.
Right, your dad's line is your paternal line. Your mother's line is your maternal line. And it's the bottom half of the chart is your mother's line, the top half is the paternal
So
line.
Patsy, your Patsy the
My
witch is
Patsy.
down this
And
way.
my Patsy, interestingly enough, 7 generations back, she's always the bottom line. The line to her is the bottom line on the chart.
Your mother's
She's my mother's. Now that's the line you know for sure, Jim.
Yes, I know.
This is Mama's baby, Daddy's maybe.
Now, you wouldn't normally write Dad.
No. How do you?
No.
No.
Sorry,
what would you
did
do
slap
at
my
the
hand or
top?
something.
Okay, I'm going to use this space right up here.
Okay.
And I'm just going to write in. If I were to start with myself, if this was me and I wrote in my dad's name,
Sure.
then my grandfather's name that would go here.
and when you're writing that out, I have a really long French-Canadian name. It's Marie-Thérèse Angeline Cloutier, and all my buddies at school started calling me Terry. The only person who actually ever calls me by my whole name is Mom when she's mad, you know. She gives you that. Marie-Thérèse.
How often did you
Oh,
do that?
well, we don't want to go into that. But, so can we put nicknames on there? Are we allowed to do that?
But you need to use the name that Mom called you when she was mad. In your case, you might want to write in your real name and write in there after your first and middle name.
Sure.
You'd write Terry and put quotation marks around it to let people know
Designate.
that it's a nickname.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And nicknames are very important because that's how people may know you and find you.
One thing that I know, a mistake I made when I got started, for example, my grandmother's name was Jenny Louise Jones, but I wrote her down as Jenny Louise Willard.
Oh, and good point, Jim.
With this, could you just put your grandmother's name down so we could see how, because I know that's a mistake I made, and it's...
And I wouldn't, although Grandma's last name was Lingo, and her last name was Walls after she married. All right, I'd write Laura Bell Lingo. Because Grandma's name, when she was born, her last name was not Walls, of course. It wasn't Walls until she married. So we write women by their maiden names on the pedigree chart. And then people say, well, what if I don't know Grandma's maiden name? Well, then just write her first and middle names and leave that. Leave that blank.
While you've been writing, I've been checking out the other spots there, and I see that you have died first, and that seems a little morbid, and you know. But is there a reason why you started with that?
Well, on some charts you will see it reversed, but in this case, think about how we're going to do the research. We're going to start with ourselves, and we're going to move backward in time. Well, as we do that, when you move back and discover information about an ancestor, you find his death before you find the birth. So that's the reason that we would do that.
So, and as you keep working back, of course, it's going to be the same for...
Right, for the others.
Sure.
Is there a special way that you would write that?
Oh yeah, the date. We have what we call a standard format in genealogy for writing a date. And I would write his death date, 8 August, 1911.
You know, we ran into, when we were doing research, in English records, they would quite often put the month, the day, and the year.
Yes.
And in French records, they quite often did the day, the month, and the year. And when they would use just numbers, like 110, you're not sure if that's January 10th or October 1st.
Right.
So it's good to have that format. There's no confusion that way.
Right, and we write the day of the month as a number. And then we write out the name of the month in full. And we always write the year as a 4-digit number, not just 2 digits,
Because
but 4.
it could be 1811 as well as 1911.
Right.
And on the place, if you have a standard form for the date, would there be a standard way that you would write out the place?
Standard, yeah, there's a standard way to write that. And for the event of his death,
I noticed that you're writing everything out, even though it's really lengthy. Is that really important?
well, for clarity it is.
Okay.
And so that there's no mistaking
So
what it
you
is.
have-
And I've written Union, comma, Independence, comma, Arkansas. So what I've written is the local place name, and then I've written the county. If this were Louisiana, I would have written the parish name.
Right.
And then the state is Arkansas. Now for foreign countries, I would do the same thing. I would write the local area first, if there was a town name, and then the next division, whatever that would be within that country, and then the name of the country.
So it's important that once we get started in doing this, we use the same format all the way through so that there
we use
wouldn't
a
be
standard
confusion.
format, sure.
Sooner or later, I mean, if we're working from memory, there's going to be gaps.
You run out of
There's
memory.
Yes, real quick in my case. But is that bad? I mean, is that
That's perfectly normal because you may know one side of the family much better than you know the other.
So you're basically saying it's like a worksheet.
This is a worksheet.
So you don't have to have it all filled in.
It doesn't have to be, and it doesn't have to be perfect, because when you do the research, you're going to find mistakes. You're going to find that somebody's name wasn't exactly what you thought it was, and so you're going to have mistakes. But it's a worksheet, and it's a guide or a roadmap. It's a tool. It's a tool that you use on your search for your ancestors.
Why wouldn't you start with Patsy? I mean,
Well,
as
it's
intriguing
tempting.
as she is, I mean, what a wonderful story.
Yes, and especially if I had a famous ancestor, it'd be very tempting, which I don't, but it would be very
Patsy
tempting
sounds pretty intriguing.
to
so.
start with a famous ancestor there. But you run the risk of working on somebody else's pedigree when you do that. Because until you start with yourself and you establish these links all the way back, you may be working on the wrong family.
As we're looking at this, what are some of the important things we should remember in getting started?
The big concept is to start with yourself.
Okay.
Start with yourself and work backward in time and connect each generation as you go. And that's the important thing. And have fun with this.
Right.
Desmond, you've
This
been
is
so
exciting.
helpful. Thank you very,
Thank you,
very
Jim.
much. This is a
Thank you,
wonderful way
Terry.
to get going.
Sure.
Thank you. Victor and Desmond have shown us how rewarding starting a search for our ancestors can be.
As you begin your search, remember these 3 tips.
First, a pedigree chart is your ancestry at a glance, a roadmap to guide your search.
Second, in doing your research, start with yourself, then work back in time.
Third, be consistent when you write names, dates, and places on your pedigree chart.
Your local library, historical, or genealogical society can help you get started. You can also visit the Ancestors homepage.
Thanks for being with us, and please join us for the next episode of Ancestors.
To learn more about ancestors, visit us at PBS Online at the internet address on your screen.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support Ancestors.
You're watching PBS.
Today on Ancestors.
Out of a family of 10,000 people, we know how we're related, right back to John and Betty Taylor Moore.
Behold, there were the most beautiful quilts. I was absolutely stunned. It was as if I had been asleep all my life.
The language was taken. The dignity, the humanity was taken. But the music wasn't.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support Ancestors.
Ancestors, with hosts Jim and Terry Willard.
100 years from now, will anyone know who you were? What legacy will you leave?
In this program, we'd like you to meet 3 people who each found unique ways to leave a legacy.
Today, Eric Moore Marshall continues a tradition that began nearly a century ago and has connected thousands of family members.
Scottish set. At the quick step, march.
In case you're wondering, we're the Moors.
Yeah. I don't have to go for the last one. Boy,
The Moore family has been the first to do a lot of interesting things, family-oriented experiences in America. We were the first to film a reunion. We had a reunion pageant filmed in 1915. Moors came, they wore fancy clothes, they participated in skits and pageants, and I was always steeped in Moor tradition. And I thought, wow, this is great. You know, I've got a relative that fought in the Revolution. How many kids can talk about that? And I've got a relative that came across on an old sailing ship from Scotland. He did some wonderful things. But we look back at this and say, he was a piece of history. We should honor him for that. When the family was organized in 1890, one of the founders of the association was Jay Gould. Jay was a great-grandson of John and Betty Moore. He saw the need to preserve their memory. And after Jay's death, his daughter, Helen Gould Shepherd, carried on the tradition of putting on this big bash every 5 years. Our festivity is being sponsored by Chuck and Linda, who are chairman of the reunion committee. And I'd like to tell you right now that we have over 150 Moors registered.
This is me, the very first time that I went to a reunion back in 1955. Right? Right there.
You meet at the reunion, you look around, you say, hey, hi cousin, how are you? And you may have never met them before, but there's a common bond there. We may look alike, We may talk alike, we may have the same religious preference, same political preference, or we may be different. It really doesn't matter. But you have that same common bond that you know of. Here we are at the site of John Moore's original cabin. We're located outside of the town of Hobart in Delaware County, New York. Here at the ruins of the cabin of John and Betty Moore, we have found a Scottish thistle growing right here. The thistle, the symbol of Scotland. Isn't that gorgeous? And this is a spot where the Moores always come back, and we make a pilgrimage out to this, what is now really just an old cow pasture. But it's still here, and it's part of our tradition and part of our family. And this is really our common place of birth for all of us. This little patch of land out here in an old pasture with a pile of rocks behind us. This is a common home for all of us that have descended from John and Betty. We're on our way to the old stone house. That's where John Moore died, and we'll see you when we get there. You are now on sacred ground. This is the home of Edward Livingston Moore. He and John built this home in 1829, and you can see the EM 1829 over the door. Moores have been coming here to this spot since 1890. We've got film of the flag ceremony in the front yard, film of the kids running around and playing, film of the reunion dinner that was held in the barn or the tent in the backyard. We are very proud of our heritage. Out of a family of 10,000 people, we know how we're related, right back to John and Betty Taylor Moore. We were the first family to keep track of our entire genealogy on computer and publish a directory of the family, which is divided into genealogical number and name. All of these things come together to make a very continuous flow of information to the family, exchange of ideas, and the whole thing hangs around the journal of the family, which comes out twice a year. We have over 2,500 family units that journal goes to. And at each reunion, we go down to the monument at the cemetery and we read the necrology for the past 5 years. And I remember what an emotional moment it was for me to hear my own mother's name read. I think the value of the family reunion is that it brings continuity and order into your own life.
Nancy Lou Burdick's life was dramatically changed when she discovered her family history woven into the quilts made by her grandmother, Tallulah.
If you've never slept under a wonderful handmade cotton quilt, you've missed something very special. we all took quilts for granted. My grandmother felt that it was her duty to make a quilt for each of her children's children. My grandfather grew the cotton, worked the fields, and my grandmother, Tallulah, left this wonderful legacy of quilts. I came to Alabama to see my aunt, Molly Ruth, Tallulah's youngest daughter, my mother's only sister, who was very ill in the hospital and was not expected to live. And I spent a week or more with her. She was the one who gave me the old family papers and commanded me to write the story of my grandmother and her quilts. She said, you know, your grandmother was an artist at quilting. The most remarkable quilt she ever made was a feather, and I don't know where it is. I wonder if you could ask Elmira, that was her sister, my mother, if she could find it. So after a week with her, I came home to the farm here and asked my mother, and she said, why, of course I know where it is. Molly Ruth gave it to me some years ago. And she took me upstairs and opened the cedar chest, and behold, there were the most beautiful quilts that she pulled out. Not only the feather, but 5 or 6 or 7 other gorgeous quilts that I had never seen in my life. I was absolutely stunned. It was as if I had been asleep all my life. I had been unaware of this humble little grandmother. That day, it was just like a transformation in my mind. All of a sudden, there they were. I knew that I had discovered a treasure. I was not ready to retire from teaching. I was still teaching. I didn't feel I could. But something compelled me to just one day go in, hand in my resignation, somewhat apprehensively, because I really hadn't planned to stop teaching then, and to begin working on the old family papers to write the story of my grandmother and her quilts. It was at first laid on me like a burden, and then it became a challenge, and then it became a joy when I was able to do it. And it really enhanced my life tremendously. The very earliest quilt that we can detect that she pieced had over 3,000 little triangles in it. She made quilts constantly. She quilted until she was 84 years old. I have to assume that she must have made at least 200 and possibly as many as 300. She had 2 daughters and 10 sons. Tallulah's 2 daughters were Elmira and Molly Ruth. They did not quilt because it represented hard times, skimping and saving, so both of them had aspirations that would put them in a position to buy blankets. Tallulah seemed to have a sense of the significance of her own life, even though she was a woman in a time when men had most of the power. My grandmother had all these broad interests and all this creativity. I have many letters that she would write to her daughter Molly Ruth about finishing a quilt, and Papa likes it so much he wants to keep it. Things like this that gave her so much joy. I think I would have liked to have been there when she had that experience of finishing a gorgeous quilt. I would like to have been there when she finished the feather quilt, which she quilted while my mother was in her cradle. I found that I absolutely could not truly get into the writing until I had begun to do the work she did with her hands. I discovered a little tintype that showed this woman with her rather large hands, and I realized that those hands had created all these beautiful quilts that I had seen, and it was just an incredible feeling to see those hands for the first time. I began to write, and then I had a terrible accident in which I broke my back, and I was confined to bed. During that time, I began to quilt. So my first quilt, I quilted lying on my back. I began to feel my grandmother's presence more definitely. And then as I got into writing her book, it seemed almost as if I was feeling her saying, yes, tell my story. It needs to be told. I want my grandchildren to inherit the values and the courage that the people of my generation had to have in order to endure the hardships of their lives. In 1943, Tallulah, at 81, picked up her pen on her 60th anniversary of her marriage to my grandfather and began to write her own memoir telling the story of her life. She explains how she began teaching herself to quilt and how she lived her life during and after the Civil War. Every family has its little scandals and its disruptions and things you wish hadn't happened. And my grandmother, in her memoir, which was the gem of all the family papers, did deal with some of those things. There are 1,000 questions I'd like to ask her now. The opportunity is gone. All of this work is making me feel, ask your questions now, find your answers now, because they will be important to your children. I also like to create things that are the result of what I have learned, such as quilts. So I've made about 22 quilts of my own. They're traditional quilts, mostly made by my grandmother's patterns. I just had an urge to replicate as many of her quilts as possible. I'm hoping someone will take it up after I leave it in the next generation to continue and tell the story of our generation.
Legacies can be created as well as passed down. Meet jazz musician Hannibal Lacumbe and his family, who celebrate the vital connection between generations with music and African ritual.
All of the elders, please assemble up front. There was never a time I felt disconnected from my ancestors. It's just that I didn't know and understand what they were and what I was feeling. But what I felt, I knew was something very powerful. In the procession, first were the drummers. We do no ceremonies without the drums. It sets the tone. It calls the spirits down. I didn't always know where my great-grandfather was buried. I found out by a combination of speaking with the elders and a powerful dream. It's really not a grave, it's an altar where the ancestors are buried, where the bones lie. That place is sacred. God has answered your prayers. We are here, grandfather. Look at the youngest of your seed. So powerful, so strong, so beautiful. Stay inside of her spirit. Be with her. My great-grandfather was a person of heroic proportions. He came to America, as most black people did, in the holds of a ship. He came over with his mother and a young brother. And they were bought by a man named Burgess. And he abused my great-grandfather's mother consistently. The elders helped my great-grandfather escape through the swamps, and they kept running until they came to Crash Prairie. And there my grandfather said, this is a beautiful place. This is a beautiful land. And he started working, building the railroad. And in 2 years, he bought and paid for the land we're now sitting on, 101 acres. So I get a lot of that kind of independence from him. People realized that he had the power to heal the spirit. So he became a primitive Baptist minister. He, instead of baptizing the traditional way, he washed their feet. And in doing this, we were not acting as though we were ministers, but we were actually asking for a blessing from those whose feet we washed. At the same time, paying homage to his tradition, his way of doing this. This tradition goes back to Africa. The idea of dancing on the grave of the ancestors is also an African tradition. The spirits of my ancestors come to me in the music. I've been able to find my way because of the music. Without the music, black people, I don't think would even exist in America, because the language was taken, the dignity, the humanity was taken, but the music wasn't. And that's how we survived. I think we should be responsible for what has gone before us. And in being responsible for that, we can understand those things that are good for the generations ahead of us and those things that are not good for them. The elders' presence let the children know where they came from and what they came from. They saw, wow, I'm part of this, gave them a connection.
How will you be remembered in 100 years? What legacy are you leaving for your family?
There are countless ways to leave a legacy. Use your imagination to create new traditions. Here are 3 ideas to get you started.
First, record your personal history in a journal.
Second, gather and organize your family photographs.
And finally, hold a family reunion. The legacy you leave will help your children and your grandchildren know who you were and who they are.
Thank you for joining us on Ancestors.
To learn more about ancestors, visit us at PBS Online at the internet address on your screen.
Ancestors is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the annual financial support of viewers like you, and Eastman Kodak Company. Some moments in your family history are truly unforgettable. Others are impossible to forget. Now they can all be shared with Kodak Image Magic, the easy way to make pictures from pictures. Proud to support Ancestors.
This is PBS.